They first saw it through dust, smoke, and disbelief. A strange American vehicle, too boxy, too thin, too open-top to be taken seriously, creeping along the tree line like a metal shadow. German officers studying the battlefield through binoculars squinted, confused. It wasn't a Sherman. It wasn't a Grant. It wasn't anything they recognized from their intelligence manuals. Its armor looked so thin a Panzer III could punch straight through it. Its profile was tall and awkward. The turret looked too angular, too exposed, almost improvised. To the veterans of panzer divisions who had battled across France, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union, this mystery vehicle seemed like a joke, something America had thrown together simply to fill space on the battlefield. What they didn't know, not yet, was that this ugly, lightly armored, budget-built machine was about to become one of the most dangerous threats their prized panzers had ever faced. They didn't know that this cheap tank cost only a third of what it took to build a Tiger I. They didn't know that inside this crude exterior was a gun that could reach them from distances where their own rounds fell harmlessly into the dirt. They didn't know that American doctrine had crafted something radically different. Not a tank, but a tank destroyer, built not for dueling, but for hunting. And they certainly didn't know that this machine, the M10 Wolverine, would soon haunt German after-action reports with the same repeated phrase, Ein dünner Amerikaner, aber unglaublich präzise, a thin American vehicle but unbelievably accurate. The story of how the M10 came to exist begins not on a battlefield, but in a meeting room in Washington, where U.S. military thinkers in 1941 faced a sobering truth. Their tanks were inferior to German machines in gunpowder and armor. The solution was unconventional. Instead of building a heavier, slower tank to match the Germans blow for blow, they decided to build something leaner, faster, more specialized, something that would strike from ambush rather than go toe-to-toe. The philosophy was controversial. Traditionalists scoffed at the idea of a vehicle designed to fight tanks without heavy armor. But American doctrine was clear. Tank destroyers would use mobility and firepower, not armor, to kill enemy tanks. Thus, the M10 was born, a turreted tank destroyer mounting the powerful 3-inch, 172.2mm gun capable of piercing the frontal armor of Panzer IVs and even Panthers under the right conditions. It had thinner armor, yes, and an open turret that left the crew frighteningly exposed to artillery and small arms fire, but it also had something no German tank had: the ability to rotate its turret quickly and engage targets across a wide field of fire without repositioning the hull. In the fluid chaos of real combat, this advantage mattered more than any armor thickness printed in a manual. American crews who first received the M10 were skeptical. They saw the open turret and felt vulnerable. They saw the thin side armor, barely enough to stop a 20mm cannon, and felt exposed. They saw the vehicle's ungainly silhouette and felt like they were being sent into battle in a coffin on tracks. But the first time they fired the 3-inch gun, everything changed. The recoil slammed into the earth like a living thing. The round streaked across hundreds of yards and hit a target dead center. Even veteran gunners were stunned. This wasn't a tank's gun. This was something far more precise. It was a scalpel disguised as a sledgehammer. The M10 made its debut in Tunisia in 1943, where American forces struggled to counter German Panzers and the deadly 88mm guns. German officers initially dismissed the M10 as leichtverstellbar, easily destroyed. But then the reports started coming in. A pair of M10s knocked out 3 Panzer IVs at long range outside Sidi Bouzid. Another ambushed a Tiger from a concealed ridge and hit it twice before the Tiger crew even knew where the fire was coming from. It wasn't luck, it was doctrine. Unlike tanks, which advanced with the infantry, M10s hunted. They sat in ambush positions, their crews scanning for movement, their commanders coordinating with forward observers and artillery spotters. Often, German tanks rolled straight into kill zones prepared hours earlier. From 1,200 yards, 1,400 yards, sometimes even beyond 1,600 yards, the M10 opened fire. German panzer crews, used to being the hunters, suddenly found themselves struck from distances where they had not expected American guns to reach. One Wehrmacht officer writing after an engagement near Sicily described his disbelief. They were not tanks. They were something else, Thin-skinned but deadly. We thought they would burn quickly. Instead, they killed quickly. This experience shattered the assumption that American armor was inferior simply because it was cheaper. The truth was more uncomfortable. The M10 didn't need thick armor because it wasn't meant to take hits, it was meant to avoid them entirely. Every German tank that moved boldly across open ground suddenly faced a new threat lurking unseen at the edges of the battlefield. By the time of Normandy in 1944, German commanders were fully aware of the M10's existence, but even then they underestimated it. They believed its thin armor made it a non-factor. They were wrong. In the bocage, where movement was restricted and every hedgerow hit a gun barrel, the M10 became a Panzer killer. Crews painted the upper hull with foliage. They reversed into firing positions. They covered their muzzle brakes with burlap to avoid glint. Panthers and Tigers fell victim not because the M10 was stronger, but because it was smarter, more flexible, and perfectly suited for the kind of war the Americans were fighting. The M10 was cheap, expendable, and deadly, a weapon built not for glory, but for victory. And as the Germans would soon learn, the battlefield didn't care about prestige or price tags. It cared about which gun fired first and which shot hit hardest. The M10 did both. And that was the threat the Germans never expected. The first time an M10 Wolverine fired from ambush in Normandy, the German crews never even saw the muzzle flash. All they heard was a distant crack. Sharp, clean, almost unimpressive, followed half a second later by the metallic scream of a shell punching through armor. A Panther, confident in the thickness of its sloped glacis, lurched violently as smoke burst from its turret ring. Its commander, stunned, shouted orders to rotate the turret toward the hedgerow line, but it was already too late. A second M10 shot drilled straight through the side armor and ignited the ammunition rack. The Panther exploded in a plume of black fire. From the outside, it looked like a duel, but it wasn't. It was a trap, one carefully laid by a weapon the Germans had underestimated for far too long. The M10 had no business winning a straight fight against a Panther or Tiger. On level ground at point-blank range, it was doomed. But American doctrine had no intention of engaging in fair fights. To the U.S. Army, the tank destroyer was a predator, not a brawler. It was meant to stalk, strike, and vanish before the enemy could respond. And in Normandy, where every hedgerow, every tree line, every barn, and every fold of terrain offered concealment, the M10 became one of the deadliest tools on the battlefield. Crews quickly learned how to exploit the M10's strengths. Its open turret wasn't just a vulnerability. It gave unparalleled visibility. 4 sets of eyes could scan the terrain without relying solely on periscopes. Spotting enemy armor even a second earlier could mean the difference between life and death. Its turret, though slower than a Sherman's, was far faster than a Panzer IV's, and infinitely more flexible than the Panther's notoriously cramped design. And its 3-inch or 76.2mm gun, when loaded with APC or HVAP rounds, could punch through the side armor of a Panther at ranges where German gunners still struggled to acquire targets. One of the most critical advantages the M10 carried into battle was its uncanny ability to disappear. Crews camouflaged them with branches, mud, burlap, and entire sections of hedgerow strapped across the hull. In some engagements, German tankers reported seeing muzzle flashes coming from trees, not realizing the tree was the tank. At Mortain, where Panzer units attempted to smash through American lines in a desperate counterattack, M10s used pre-surveyed killing grounds to devastating effect. Crews reversed into hull-down positions, exposed only their gun and turret rim, fired 2 or 3 rounds, then backed down behind cover before the Germans could return fire. Panther commanders, expecting to dominate the battlefield with superior armor, found themselves facing an invisible enemy, one that struck from 1,200 yards and melted back into the landscape. The M10's speed, especially compared to heavier German armor, turned every fight into a chess match. A Tiger I could barely manage 38 km/h on roads and half that in rough terrain. A Panther, though faster on paper, suffered frequent mechanical breakdowns. The M10, relatively light, and powered by a reliable GMC diesel engine, could reposition rapidly between firing points. American doctrine taught M10 units to move constantly, never linger, never fight from the same position twice. German gunners complained bitterly in after-action reports. Der Feind fährt wie ein Geist. Wir schießen, aber ist schon verschwunden. The enemy drives like a ghost. We fire, but he is already gone. But nothing frustrated the Germans more than the M10's long-range lethality. Their entire armored doctrine relied on closing the distance, using superior optics and frontal armor to dominate at medium range. Against the Sherman, this worked. Against the M10, it didn't. The Wolverine fired accurately from positions far beyond those expected of a cheap American tank. German crews found themselves under fire from angles they believed were safe. In the bocage, the M10 could shoot through 2 hedgerows, relocate, and fire again from a completely new direction within minutes. One Panther ace later wrote, "We believed only an 88mm gun could reach us at those distances. Then we learned the Americans had a new weapon." The M10's deadliness grew exponentially when paired with forward observers and artillery, a hallmark of American combined arms doctrine. In Lorraine, M10 units lured Panther platoons into fields where artillery had pre-targeted every possible German approach route. As the Panzers advanced to chase the retreating M10s, the sky erupted with 105mm and 155mm shells. Blinded by explosions and forced to change formation, the Panthers exposed their flanks, and the M10s, waiting in ambush, opened fire. In one engagement, an M10 platoon destroyed 5 Panthers in under 10 minutes, none of them at a range closer than 900 yards. Even German infantry began to fear the M10. Its ability to appear suddenly, fire with incredible precision, then retreat before counterfire, made it feel less like a tank and more like an artillery piece with wheels. Wehrmacht after-action reports routinely described the M10 as an American tank with thin armor but unnerving accuracy, or a vehicle that fights from impossible distances. The irony was painful for the Germans. They had sunk enormous resources into creating armored monsters, Tigers that required 54,000 man-hours to build, Panthers that consumed precious alloys and fuel, vehicles that looked invincible on paper. Yet here was a cheap American machine, costing 1/3 as much, killing those monsters with ambushes, mobility, and coordination. By the end of 1944, a quiet dread crept into Panzer units, not a fear of being outgunned, but a fear of being outsmarted. The M10 proved that armor thickness meant little if your enemy controlled the engagement. It proved that a cheap gun in the right place could defeat a million Reichsmark tank. And it proved that German officers didn't just misjudge American armor, they misjudged American thinking. The M10 wasn't a tank. It was a hunter. And on the battlefields of Normandy, Lorraine, and Alsace, it hunted panzers with terrifying efficiency. The Panther cost 117,000 Reichsmarks. The Tiger cost nearly 300,000. The M10 Wolverine, barely a fraction of that. A German officer summarized it bitterly after the war. "We built masterpieces. The Americans built weapons." And nowhere was this contrast clearer than on the battlefields of 1944, where the M10, thin-skinned, open-topped, and made with the bare minimum of armor, began dismantling the myth of German armored superiority, one burning Panzer at a time. The Germans had built tanks like watchmakers, with precision, complexity, and craftsmanship bordering on obsession. The Tiger, with its intricate overlapping road wheels and massive 88mm gun, was a marvel, but it required immense resources, skilled laborers, and enough rare metals to build 3 American vehicles. The Panther was faster and more modern, but its transmission failures and mechanical fragility demanded long hours of maintenance for every hour in combat.
These were tanks built for excellence. Tanks that demanded a perfect battlefield to show their perfect design. War, however, is never perfect, and the M10 thrived in that imperfection. American tank destroyer doctrine rejected the idea of building supertanks. Instead, the M10 was designed to be the exact opposite of a Tiger: simple, cheap, flexible, and replaceable. Lose one, and another rolled in. Break one, and mechanics fixed it in the field within hours. Americans didn't need a tank that cost 3 times as much. They needed a weapon that could be built by the thousands, shipped across oceans, and adapted to dozens of roles. The M10 was exactly that. Where German tanks relied on armor to survive, the M10 relied on not being hit at all, and this changed everything. Crews didn't fight like tankers, they fought like hunters. They positioned the vehicle in ambush spots, often at angles that nullified German armor entirely. The 3-inch gun fired from concealed positions, exploiting terrain in ways German doctrine never accounted for. The Germans expected frontal engagements. The M10 refused to give them one. In Italy, during an engagement near the Liri Valley, a Panther platoon rolled confidently down a terraced hillside, expecting to cut through American armor as they had dozens of times before. Instead, the first Panther erupted in flame from a hit that punched clean through its lower side armor. The second Panther reversed too late, another round smashed into its turret ring. The surviving German officers demanded to know what type of American tank had destroyed 2 Panzers so quickly. The answer stunned them. Not a tank, an M10. What made the M10 truly terrifying to German crews was not just its firepower. It was its ability to hit them before they even realized they were in danger. Unlike German guns, which were optimized for medium-range duels, the M10 crews trained for long-range precision fire. The Wolverine's gun, when properly sighted, could reach out across fields, through hedgerows, or down narrow village streets with lethal accuracy. German commanders were used to identifying American positions visually before committing to an attack, but M10s denied them that luxury. One Panzer commander described the first time he faced an M10 in Normandy. "We saw nothing, we heard nothing, only the explosion when the lead tank died." Then there was speed. The M10, lighter than any German heavy tank, repositioned rapidly, often shifting firing angles before the Germans could traverse their turrets. Panzer crews, saddled with a notoriously slow traverse rate, struggled to track M10s that fired once, then reversed behind cover to reappear seconds later at an entirely different angle. German gunners trained to identify American Shermans at closer ranges found themselves being outmaneuvered by a vehicle that cost less, moved faster, and fought smarter. And then came the killer combination: M10s working with U.S. artillery. No other army integrated armor and artillery as seamlessly as the Americans. Forward observers directed 105 and 155 millimeter guns with astonishing speed. Panzer commanders would spot an M10 and begin maneuvering to flank it, only to stumble directly into a pre-registered fire zone. Shells rained down, dust choked the battlefield. Amid the chaos, the M10 reappeared and fired into the Panzer's exposed sides. To German crews, it felt like fighting a ghost supported by thunder. This synergy made even cheap machines incredibly dangerous. American doctrine wasn't about the quality of one vehicle, it was about the lethality of the entire system. Reconnaissance, artillery, air support, and tank destroyers working as a single organism. The Germans had better tanks, the Americans had a better machine for war. The irony wasn't lost on German officers. One frustrated major wrote in his diary, "The Americans build tin cans, but they fight with them like wolves. They strike from where we do not expect. We fire at shadows." This frustration deepened during the Battle of Oracourt, where M10s and M18s wiped out entire panzer brigades using nothing more than speed, camouflage, and ambush doctrine. German officers demanded to know how U.S. forces were killing panzers without losing equivalent numbers themselves. The after-action reports revealed the uncomfortable truth. M10s were simply outsmarting their opponents, and they were doing it cheaply. A Tiger platoon might cost as much as an entire company of M10s, and yet the M10s properly employed often destroyed more German armor than they lost. The greatest blow to German pride wasn't that their Panzers were being destroyed, it was that they were being destroyed by vehicles they considered inferior, by weapons they had dismissed as crude, simplistic, and unworthy of concern. The M10 proved a brutal truth about modern warfare. You don't need the best machine, you need the right one. And the M10 was exactly the right machine to kill Panzers.
The M10 was deadly on its own, but when it fought alongside American artillery, the most flexible, responsive, and devastating fire support of World War II, it became something far more terrifying than a tank destroyer. It became the tip of a perfectly synchronized killing machine. German officers used to dueling tanks in fields or forests suddenly found themselves fighting an entire system, one in which the M10 was only the first piece of a much larger ambush. And once a Panzer unit stepped into that system, escape became almost impossible. American doctrine emphasized something the Germans had never fully grasped. Tanks did not fight alone. They fought with radios, linking them to infantry, to reconnaissance teams, to forward observers riding jeeps, half-tracks, or even perched on church towers. They fought with artillery batteries dozens of miles away, ready to fire within minutes. The M10 wasn't the centerpiece, it was the trigger that set everything else in motion. This was most brutally demonstrated in Lorraine in late 1944. Panzer Brigade 106 rolled forward expecting a traditional armored clash. Instead, they entered a battlefield that had been mapped, measured, and pre-sighted by American artillery for hours. M10s positioned themselves behind ridges and hedgerows, engines idling, commanders scanning through binoculars for the first glint of German armor. Behind them, field telephones and radios linked their platoons directly to artillery crews manning 105mm and 155mm howitzers. Every road, fork, and open field had coordinates assigned. Every turn a Panzer made was anticipated. The moment the first German tank appeared, charging forward with confidence, an M10 fired a ranging shot. Whether it hit or not didn't matter. That flash, that report, that single shell was the signal. Within seconds, American forward observers relayed the coordinates. Fire mission, Battery 6, armor concentration. Then the sky opened. A curtain of artillery fires smothered the German formation. Dust, flame, and shrapnel turned the field into a smoking nightmare. Panthers and Panzer IVs lurched forward blindly, trying to escape the kill zone, and that was when the M10 struck. As soon as the German tanks exposed their flanks, forced out of formation by the artillery barrage, the M10s emerged from cover, fired 2 or 3 precision shots, then reversed back into concealment. German tankers rarely saw where the rounds came from. "We fought the earth as if the hills themselves were firing at us," one Panther commander later wrote. This deadly interplay repeated itself across France and the Low Countries. At Hutgern Forest, artillery would isolate advancing German armor, cutting it off from infantry support. Then M10s slipped through narrow forest roads and hit the immobilized tanks from unexpected angles. At Falaise, German armor retreating through choke points encountered pre-registered American guns that pounded them mercilessly. Once panic set in, M10s swept forward and began picking off survivors. Coordination between artillery and tank destroyers became so effective that many German units believed the Americans had significantly more armored forces than they actually did. Wehrmacht intelligence summaries written during Operation Cobra noted, "The Americans field an unusually high number of tanks capable of extreme long-range accuracy." They were wrong. The US was not deploying more tanks, they were deploying more integration. German tank commanders had been trained to fight one enemy at a time, a Soviet T-34, a British Firefly, an American Sherman. They were not prepared to fight a web of enemies acting as one, an M10 on the ridge, a spotter in the trees, a battery of howitzers 6 miles away, and air reconnaissance circling overhead. When one engaged, all engaged. When one fired, all fired. The most chilling example came during the Battle of Ericourt. Fog hung low across the French countryside. German Panthers advanced, thinking the weather gave them the advantage, but American observers on nearby ridges tracked every movement with sound ranging and map plotting. When the fog lifted for a brief window, the U.S. unleashed one of the most coordinated ambushes of the entire war. Artillery smashed into the vanguard. M10s moved into crossfire positions. Air support strafed retreating vehicles. In 2 days, the Americans destroyed over 30 German tanks with barely any losses of their own. Not because the M10 was invincible, not because it was better engineered, but because it was part of a system the Germans hadn't even realized they were fighting against, and that was the M10's greatest secret. It didn't win by overpowering the Tiger or Panther. It won by overwhelming them through teamwork, timing, communication, and carefully orchestrated violence. To German tank crews, it seemed impossible. How could a cheap, thin-skinned American vehicle destroy their best armor? How could something that cost a fraction of a Tiger kill one at long range? The answer, one learned too late, was that the M10 was never meant to duel the Tiger head-on. It was built to fight with the entire weight of American firepower behind it, turning every battlefield into a trap. A German officer captured near Aachen put it bluntly, "We did not lose to your tanks, we lost to your cooperation." The M10 wasn't a miracle machine. It wasn't even a great tank. But in the hands of an army that mastered coordination, it became something far more dangerous than the Germans expected, a cheap weapon that fought like an army all by itself.
The M10 Wolverine never inspired awe the way the Tiger did. It never carried the prestige of the Panther, the iconic silhouette of the Sherman, or the sleek speed of the Hellcat. In museums today, it often sits quietly in corners, overshadowed by more glamorous giants of the war. It has no imposing armor, no monstrous gun, no legendary duels immortalized in documentaries. And yet, for the German officers who faced it, the M10 became something far more unsettling than a battlefield icon. It became proof that their philosophy of mechanized warfare was collapsing. What terrified the Germans was not the M10's raw power, because it didn't have much. It wasn't the armor, because it barely had any. It wasn't even the cost, though the fact that America could build 3 M10s for every 1 Tiger was a humiliation in itself. What terrified them was something much deeper. The M10 proved that Germany could no longer define the terms of armored warfare. For years, German armor doctrine dominated Europe. The Blitzkrieg shattered armies from Poland to France. Panzer divisions wrote the rulebook. German tanks dictated engagement ranges, dictated tactics, dictated who lived and who died. But the M10 flipped the script. Suddenly, tanks costing a fraction of a Panther were killing them from distances they considered impossible. Cheap vehicles, mass-produced, lightly armored, and crewed by young American soldiers were outthinking and outshooting the best crews the Reich could field. After the war, captured German officers admitted respectful gratitude for the M10. One Oberstleutnant wrote in a 1946 interrogation report, "It was not a tank in the traditional sense. It was a weapon of opportunity, not a weapon of dominance. It struck where we did not expect and moved before we could answer." This was the essence of the M10's legacy. It forced German commanders to confront the reality that the battlefield no longer belonged to the machine with the thickest armor. It belonged to the army that used its machines the smartest. When historians look back at the M10, they often dismiss it as a transitional design, an awkward stepping stone between the ad hoc tank destroyer concepts of 1942 and the more sophisticated M18 and M36 that followed. But that interpretation misses the truth. The M10 wasn't just a stepping stone, it was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that mobility, precision, camouflage, and coordination mattered more than brute strength. It showed that a tank's value wasn't measured in millimeters of armor, but in how effectively it worked within an integrated system. That is the M10's true legacy. It didn't change the war by itself. It changed the way war was fought. This change rippled outward. The M18 Hellcat, the fastest armored vehicle of the war, inherited the M10's philosophy of speed and ambush. The M36 Jackson, mounting a 90mm gun that terrified even the Panther, refined the Wolverine's firepower first doctrine. American tank destroyers improved because the M10 proved the idea worked. Even Germany, late in the war, attempted to mimic American mobility-based anti-tank tactics, but without radios, fuel, or an equivalent doctrine, their attempts came too late to matter. But the M10's influence didn't stop there. When the U.S. Army re-examined armored warfare after 1945, it recognized something profound. The distinction between tanks and tank destroyers no longer made sense. A true modern fighting vehicle needed to combine firepower, mobility, and protection, not separate them into specialized roles. This thinking led directly to the concept of the main battle tank, the machine that replaced both tanks and tank destroyers. And that evolution, through the Pershing, the Patton series, and ultimately the M60 and M1 Abrams, traces its roots back to the lessons learned from the M10. The Germans, too, recognized the shift. Their post-war advisors, working with NATO, wrote extensively about how American tank destroyer doctrine had blindsided them. They concluded that the M10 represented a new kind of threat, a threat not born of superior engineering, but of superior integration. In their evaluations, the M10 was described as economical, efficient, and disturbingly effective. But perhaps the clearest testament to the M10's legacy came not from officers or historians, but from the men who served inside it. Veterans remembered the Wolverine with a mix of fear and pride. They hated the open turret that exposed them to artillery. They cursed the thin armor that made every German shell feel like a coin toss. But they loved its gun. They loved its speed. They loved the way it could slip into a firing position, unleash devastation, and sprint away before the Germans could return fire. Many remembered it simply as the ambush machine. One M10 commander from the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion put it this way: "It wasn't pretty, it wasn't safe, but it did exactly what it was built to do. And it did it better than the Germans ever expected." That is the quiet, enduring power of the M10. It didn't win the war with brute strength. It won by refusing to fight the way the Germans wanted. It won by being cheap, fast, accurate, and everywhere at once. It won by proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is the one your enemy dismissed until it was too late.